Hi, everyone. So, this is David J. Kent again, and this week, in celebration of the release of my new book, Lincoln in New England in Search of His Forgotten Tours, I'm just giving some background on Lincoln's relationship with each of the six New England states, so one state per video. Today, we're going to do Rhode Island. So, Lincoln went to New England twice in his life, and it was on his second trip in 1860 that he stopped in Rhode Island. In fact, he stopped in Rhode Island twice, and yet the total time in the state was less than 2 days. Now, there is a Lincoln, Rhode Island, and this one is, in fact, named for Abraham Lincoln. It got its start in 1871, about 5 years after the assassination, when the town split off from Smithfield and named itself Lincoln. So this is one of the few cities in New England, especially, that's actually named after Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln, of course, gave his Cooper Union speech in New York. He stayed up all night to go to dinner with the organizers, then went to the newspaper, the Tribune, and he proofread the newspaper print of his speech, which was printed very early the next morning. So he didn't get to bed until like 2 or 3 a.m. And by 7 a.m., he was on a train headed for Providence, Rhode Island. So he had been asked to give a speech on his way up to visit his son, Robert, who was then at Phillips Exeter Academy in lower southern New Hampshire. So he said, well, I have to stay overnight anyway. I have to go through Providence. I'll give a speech there. And he basically gave a version of his Cooper Union speech. In fact, once he gets to New Hampshire, which was at the next stop, he writes to his wife and he says that, well, my speech in New York went off passably well because he had prepared for it for months, but he was finding it difficult to make others before reading audiences who had already seen all of his ideas in print. And we saw he would like vary the speech a bit, but basically he was giving his Cooper Union speech. Now, Rhode Island is important to Lincoln's history and American history in part, not entirely, but in part, because it was a major part of the triangle trade. In Newport and Bristol, they would get molasses, sugar in the form of molasses from the south. They would turn it into rum. Then they built a lot of ships. They would go to Africa. They would trade this rum for Africans that they would bring back to the south and to Brazil and other places to be enslaved. So, in fact, Brown University, which is the big Ivy League university in Rhode Island, in Providence, was originally the College of Rhode Island, and it was turned into Brown because John, Nicholas, Joseph, and Moses Brown, these four brothers, they decided to go into the slave trading business. And it was pretty excruciating experience for Moses and two of the others. John Brown was like, I'm going to keep doing the slave trading. Now, obviously, this is not the same John Brown as we know, but John Brown, one of the four brothers, continued slave trading for a while, and pointed out to his brother Moses, who had gotten religion and decided that he didn't like slavery, that the cotton mills that made Moses rich still came from uh, slave grown cotton. So there's a lot of history in all of the Ivies in the Northeast where they got a lot of money from either slave trading directly or through interactions with Southern monies. So some of the key people in Rhode Island, I mean, it's a small state, and he didn't spend much time there. But when we think of Rhode Island today, I mean, Lincoln scholars probably think of Frank Williams, who is a retired Chief Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. He's also the co-founder of the Lincoln Forum and a big Lincoln scholar. Two people you probably never heard of, Latimer Ballou and Edward Harris. They were actually very big businessmen in Woonsocket, and they were the ones who talked Lincoln into coming back to Rhode Island after he had been in New Hampshire, after he had been in several places in Connecticut, come back to Woonsocket in the very northern part of Rhode Island on the border of Massachusetts to give a speech there. Now, somebody we wouldn't think of necessarily as General Ambrose Burnside, the Civil War general. He was actually born in Indiana, but later he was in Rhode Island. He was the three-time governor of Rhode Island and a businessman there. Um, Another person that we might not think of that's very important is Isaac Stevens. He also was a Civil War general. He also was born somewhere else. He was born in Massachusetts. He died up the road from my house in Fairfax, Virginia, in the Battle of Ox Hill or Chantilly. And even though he was born in Massachusetts, died here in Virginia, his he's actually buried in Newport, Rhode Island, in Island Cemetery, with plenty of other famous people. There was another Rhode Islander, actual Rhode Islander, who was a sitting senator. He became a senator in 1859, and I mention him only because his name is Henry Anthony, not because anybody would have heard of him, but he actually was called the father of the Senate because he served for 25 years in the Senate. Now, today I think there are a few people that have served longer. Somebody else who was not born in Rhode Island, he was born in Indiana and died in New Hampshire, but graduated from Brown, is John Hay. And John Hay, we all know John Hay and John Nicolay were Lincoln's personal secretaries, and he was the one who the two of them worked through Lincoln's biography. Uh, the Hay papers are in Brown. That's where people go to look for information about John Hay, who became quite a statesman in his own right. Now, one other person that I want to mention, because I think the guy is just really, really interesting. William Sprague the Fourth. He was the latest in a long line of very famous and very rich Spragues. When Lincoln went up to Rhode Island in 1860, he went and he spoke at the Republican convention in Rhode Island with the Republican candidate for governor. And that Republican candidate for governor was Seth Padelford. Seth Padelford was pretty much an extreme left wing Republican at the time. The Republicans, remember, were the Liberal Party. So he was more extreme, and he was their nominee for the Republican Party. But the Republican Party, the Liberal Party, does what Liberal parties do. If they don't like something about one person, they split into parts. So the Republican Party spun off this Union Republican Party, or just sometimes just called the Union Party, and they put up William Sprague the Fourth as their candidate. So they basically were running against themselves. And then there was a Democrat who, I don't even remember who that was. But Sprague ended up winning that election uh, pretty handily. And that kind of helped Lincoln realize that, maybe a more moderate Republican is a good has a good path forward here. So Sprague became governor in 1860, in 1861 and 62. They had to run every year, and he was governor for several years. He actually, as a sitting Rhode Island governor, put together a regiment, went down to Virginia, and fought pretty bravely in the first battle of Bull Run. He had two horses shot out from under him, and he fought bravely. And he was not that happy with the other generals who caused the the rout. So he was interesting in that particular point. He also became a senator in 1863, and if you know his name at all, it's probably because William Sprague IV married Kate Chase, who was Salmon P. Chase's daughter. Now, he was an interesting guy in part because there were a lot of scandals related to him. He did a lot of things that were a little bit sketchy during the war to try to secure cotton for the cotton mills that he owned back in Rhode Island. That was where the family wealth came from. It had been early on, obviously, a lot of people were in shipbuilding and slave trading. He had made a lot of money on the cotton mills. So he was trying to secure this cotton from the South. So that was kind of a problem. He also was a bit of a drinker and a womanizer. So he got into trouble for that. The one good thing that Sprague did is immediately after Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, September 22nd, 1862, Sprague and his fellow senator, by this time he was a senator, he became a senator in 1860, 1863. He was almost a senator. But he and the sitting senator at the time pushed Lincoln and said, you need, now that you have this Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one, you need to get in black troops. And Lincoln writes to him, and he says, you know, I'm sure you cannot be ignorant of my strong desire to oblige you. So he's telling him, it's like, yeah, I want them too, in late September of 1862. But so far in my own judgment, I can consistently do that, but I cannot now do so. He was making the argument that, yes, I have the preliminary emancipation, but I can't get black troops yet. So, but he was thinking about it and he wanted it. So sometimes people say, well, you know, he was just kind of pushed into it. He did want it, and were people pushing him, but he decided that, you know, I can't do it. So after the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, that's when he said, yeah, and we can have the United States colored troops. You know, we can get black troops in. But Sprague was one of those people pushing for it. So that was one of the good things about Sprague. He had a lot of issues as well. Now, I've been talking about what the New England states did at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. And the first ballot, Rhode Island had 6 votes. On the first ballot, they gave 0 votes to Lincoln. They also gave 0 votes to Seward. On the second ballot, said, okay, we'll give Lincoln 3 of our 6 votes. They gave him half. And the others were just going to just random people. They didn't have a native son or anything. By the third ballot, they gave 5 out of the 6 to Lincoln. Nowhere along the way did they ever give anything to Seward. So while they were a little slow to support Lincoln, they certainly weren't helping out Seward, who had expected to get all of New England. So that's Rhode Island. Again, he only spent less than 2 days there, so it wasn't a whole lot, and it's a small state. So that's Rhode Island, and the next video I'm going to do is going to be New Hampshire, the Granite State, and there he spent several more days in New Hampshire, and there's a lot more connections. So we'll talk about that in the next video.